The fog over Lochdubuff was as thick as a spun-wool blanket and tasted faintly of sea salt and old peat smoke. It muffled the sounds of the village, turning the usually sharp cries of the gulls into ghostly echoes. For Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, the weather was an absolute blessing. Thick fog meant tourists stayed indoors. Speeding motorists were forced to crawl. And, most importantly, the telephone in the police station was less likely to ring with complaints of missing sheep. Hamish sat in a small, weathered rowboat, completely concealed by the grey soup, rolling off the loch. He pulled hard on a frayed rope, hauling a suspiciously well-placed lobster pot over the gunwale. "Just the one, Lugs," Hamish whispered to the small, fiercely ugly dog, sitting at the bow. Lugs thumped his tail once against the damp wood, keeping his ears pricked. Enough for a decent supper, but not enough to look like commerce. Hamish possessed a lanky, deceptively fragile frame, topped with flaming red hair and a pair of hazel eyes that usually looked half asleep. To the casual observer, and especially to his superiors in Strathbane, he was a village idiot in a uniform, a man entirely devoid of ambition. This was a carefully cultivated lie. Hamish Macbeth liked his life exactly as it was. He liked his slow mornings, his mooched cups of coffee, and the absolute certainty that he would never be promoted and transferred to a dismal, crime-ridden city. With the illegal lobster safely stowed under a tarp, Hamish rowed lazily back to the pier. He was just tying the boat to an iron ring when the grating, agonizing screech of the village bus cut through the fog. Hamish sighed. The bus arrival meant the arrival of the outside world. He scooped up Lugs, secured his catch, and ambled up the stone steps toward the harbour road, deciding that a noon-announced patrol to the Lochdubuff Inn was in order. Mostly because the inn served excellent scones, and if he looked cold enough, the innkeeper's wife would usually provide one for free. By the time Hamish reached the inn, the bus had already coughed a cloud of black exhaust into the fog and rattled away. Standing outside the heavy oak doors of the inn was a man who practically radiated irritation. He had not arrived in a sleek, chauffeured vehicle, but he clearly felt he deserved to have done so. He was a quintessential Sassenach, an Englishman from the home counties, dressed in a tweed suit that looked far too new and far too expensive to have ever encountered actual mud. Beside him sat two oversized hard-shell suitcases. Hamish slouched against the stone wall of the inn, pulling his peaked cap down slightly, and watched. "Is this it?" The man barked at the empty street, kicking one of his suitcases. "I was told this was a premier Highland retreat. It looks like a set from a depressing documentary." Hamish decided it was time to make an appearance. He stepped out of the fog, hands deep in the pockets of his regulation tunic, looking completely vacuous. "Grand morning for it, sir," Hamish said, his Highland lilt thick and lazy. The man jumped, then scowled. "Good God, where did you spring from? Are you the porter?" "I am the police, sir. Constable Macbeth. Can I be of assistance?" The newcomer looked Hamish up and down, his lip curling at the frayed cuffs of Hamish's sweater, peeking out from under his tunic. "I highly doubt it, Richard Sterling. I'm expected inside. Though why they couldn't send a car to the train station instead of forcing me onto that rustic death trap of a bus is beyond my comprehension. The roads can be tricky in the fog, Mr. Sterling," Hamish said mildly, ignoring the insult. "The bus is safer. It's too big to fall down most of the cliffs." Sterling blinked, entirely missing the dry humor. He pushed past Hamish, dragging his suitcases over the threshold of the inn. Hamish followed, drawn by the smell of roasting coffee and the promise of a warm fire. Inside, the inn was cozy, smelling of floor wax and bacon. At the reception desk stood Mr. Murray, a stout, usually cheerful local who currently looked as though he had swallowed a wasp. "What do you mean, shared bathroom?" Sterling's voice echoed off the wood-panelled walls, loud enough to startle a couple of elderly tourists trying to quietly eat their porridge in the corner. "I booked the executive suite." "We dinner have executive suites, Mr. Sterling," Murray said, his jaw tight. "It's a traditional Highland inn. Room 4 has a lovely view of the loch, and the bathroom is just across the hall." "Unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. I am here to oversee the purchase of the surrounding timber rights. and I expect adequate accommodation. I have half a mind to buy this wretched pub, just to fire you." Hamish drifted to a chair near the blazing hearth. He sank into the worn leather, stretching his long legs out toward the fire. Lugs curled up immediately at his boots. The constable kept his face entirely blank, a perfect mask of rural stupidity. But his mind was already cataloguing Richard Sterling. The man was wealthy, arrogant, and loud. He was in Lochdebuff to buy up timber rights, which would instantly infuriate half the village, especially the local conservationists and the farmers who grazed their sheep near the woods. Sterling was a walking disaster. He was the kind of man who started arguments in pubs, threatened local livelihoods, and generated a massive amount of tedious paperwork. Hamish accepted a mug of steaming black coffee from the waitress with a grateful nod. Taking a slow, scolding sip, he watched Sterling continue to berate the innkeeper over the lack of a cellular signal. A man like that, Hamish thought to himself, scratching lugs behind the ears, is going to make a lot of enemies in a very short amount of time. Hamish just prayed the man would finish his business and leave before somebody in Lochdebuff decided to do something drastically violent to him. Murder was terrible for the village, but worse, it always brought Detective Chief Inspector Blair down from Strathbane. And Blair had a nasty habit of interfering with Hamish's perfectly lazy life. "Just a quiet week," Hamish muttered into his coffee mug. "That's all I ask." But as he watched Sterling angrily demand a discount from Mr. Murray, Hamish felt a familiar, cold sinking feeling in his stomach that had nothing to do with the Highland fog outside. The following morning brought a biting, crystal-clear frost that turned the heather into spun-glass and made the air sharp enough to slice a man's lungs. The fog had vanished, leaving Lochdebuff bathed in a pale, indifferent sunlight. Inside the police station, Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his most solemn duty, avoiding the telephone. He sat by the wood stove, watching the leftover stew bubble. Lugs were asleep. Hamish had just decided to pour thick, black coffee when the station's front door burst open with a crash. It was Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, a formidable woman built like a Highland fortress. Her face, usually the color of a bruised plum from constant outrage, was entirely chalk white. "Hamish Macbeth, get off your lazy backside this instant," she bellowed, clutching a sensible tweed handbag against her chest like a shield. Hamish blinked slowly, projecting maximum sluggishness. "Morning, Mrs. Wellington. Can I offer you tea? You look as though you've seen a ghost, or worse, a tourist asking for directions." "This is no time for your feeble jokes. It's that awful Englishman, the loud one who was shouting at the post office yesterday about the lack of artisanal cheese." "Mr. Sterling," Hamish sighed, mourning his quiet morning. "What's he done now?" insulted the baker. "Tried to buy the loach?" "He's dead, you great lummox. In the sheep dip." Hamish froze, his hand halfway to the coffee pot. The lazy facade slipped for a fraction of a second, his hazel eyes sharpening into predatory focus, before he blinked and restored his usual bovine expression. "Dead? Are you sure he's not just resting, Mrs. Wellington? The sheep dip is powerful stuff. It can make a man dizzy, unless he can rest with his head completely submerged and his expensive brogues pointing straight at the heavens." "He is dead," she snapped. "Down at the McLean farm." Hamish groaned inwardly. A murder, the paperwork alone, would keep him indoors for a week. And worse, it would bring DCI Blair. "Right," he muttered, grabbing his peaked cap and his regulation coat. "Come on, lugs work." Lugs whined, thoroughly unimpressed by the concept. The walk to the McLean farm was brisk. Frost crunched under Hamish's heavy boots. When he arrived, a small crowd of villagers had already gathered near the stone-walled holding pens, whispering in hushed, excited tones. Hamish pushed through them, keeping his shoulders stooped and his mouth slightly open. The very picture of a bewildered country copper. "Stand back now, nothing to see," Hamish said, though there was clearly a great deal to see. Richard Sterling, the arrogant outsider from the day before, was indeed in the sheep dip. It was a long concrete trough filled with foul-smelling, chemical-laced water meant to rid the flock of ticks. Sterling was pitched forward, submerged from the waist up. His legs, clad in the now ruined, bespoke tweed trousers, dangled awkwardly over the edge. One of his expensive leather shoes was missing entirely, revealing a single, brightly patterned argyle sock. Dr. Brodie, the village physician, was already there, looking grim. He was an older man who tolerated Hamish's laziness, because he secretly suspected Hamish was the only sensible man in the village. "Morning, Hamish," Dr. Brodie grunted. "Looks like someone didn't take kindly to his plans for the timber." "Is he definitively deceased, Doctor?" Hamish asked, scratching the back of his neck as if confused by the sight. "Drowned or suffocated by the chemicals. Been here since the early hours by the stiffness of him," Brodie replied. "Shall we pull him out?" "Best wait," Hamish said, his eyes scanning the frosted grass around the trough. He appeared to be aimlessly kicking at a clod of dirt, but he was meticulously mapping the footprints. There were heavy boots, Maclean's likely, and the smooth soles of Sterling's shoes. But there was a third set, narrower. The frost had melted slightly and frozen again, preserving a faint, elegant heel mark. A woman's shoe. Hamish also noticed a peculiar scent beneath the eye-watering stench of the sheep dip, a faint whiff of expensive, musky cologne, the kind Sterling had worn yesterday, mixed with something else, something floral and completely out of place in a sheep pen. Lavender? No, something rarer. "Clumsy fellow," Hamish muttered aloud, playing his part. "Must have been out for a stroll, lost his way in the dark, and tripped headfirst into the trough. A terrible accident." The villagers murmured in agreement. It was easier to believe the outsider was simply stupid. But Hamish knew it was murder. A man tripping doesn't lose a tightly laced shoe without a struggle, and a man doesn't walk 2 miles out of the village in the freezing dark just to look at a sheep dip. "I'll have to call headquarters," Hamish said, his voice dripping with genuine misery. "The peace of Lochduff was shattered. DCI Blair will be down from Strathbane by lunchtime." A collective shudder went through the crowd. Blair was universally despised. Hamish stood by the foul-smelling trough, mourning his cold coffee and his undisturbed life. He had a dead businessman, a missing shoe, a strange footprint, and an impending invasion by his screaming boss. It was shaping up to be a truly miserable Tuesday. The peace of Lochduff was officially obliterated at precisely 11 o'clock by the ear-splitting wail of sirens. It was a completely unnecessary display. The crime scene was not going anywhere, and the victim was quite famously not going to get up and leave. But such was the way of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He arrived in a convoy of 2 black patrol cars, tires spinning on the gravel of the Maclean farm, scattering a group of terrified Highland sheep who had been minding their own business. Hamish Macbeth watched from the lee of the stone wall, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Beside him, Lugs let out a low, mournful growl. Hamish mirrored the sentiment exactly. He saw the doors fly open and DCI Blair emerge, his face already flushed a deep, apoplectic purple, his uniform straining at the buttons as if his own ego were physically inflating him. "Macbeth," Blair roared, the sound echoing off the hillsides like a crack of thunder. "Where are you? You useless, loafing, miserable excuse for a constable." Hamish stepped out from behind the wall, moving with the deliberate, agonizing slowness of a man who had all the time in the world. He tipped his cap, a gesture that managed to be respectful while simultaneously insulting. "Morning, Chief Inspector. Fine day for a drive, isn't it?" Blair marched over, his heavy boots crushing the frosted grass. He stopped inches from Hamish's face, his eyes bulging. "Do not talk to me about the weather, you monumental waste of space. I am told there is a corpse in a sheep dip. A businessman. An English businessman with significant financial interests in this region. And you. You were the first on the scene." "I was," Hamish admitted, keeping his voice flat and monotone. "Found him about an hour ago. Seems to have fallen in. Poor soul." Blair let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. He spun on his heel and strode toward the trough, his subordinates trailing behind him like anxious ducklings. He peered over the edge of the concrete wall, took one look at the submerged body of Richard Sterling, and instantly recoiled, holding a handkerchief to his nose. Disgusting, Blair bellowed. Look at this, Sergeant. An obvious case of agrarian thuggery. Some local yokel clearly took exception to this man's business proposals and decided to drown him like a sick puppy. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at old man McLean, who was standing nearby, wringing his flat cap in his hands. You there? You own this farm? You're under arrest, you old goat. Now, sir, Hamish interjected, stepping forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. Mr. McLean is 82. I don't think his back would allow him to haul a man of Mr. Sterling's size into a trough, even if he had the motive, which he doesn't. He was quite fond of the timber royalties. Quiet, Macbeth. Blair turned on him, his face darkening from purple to near black. I don't need your half-witted observations. I am the lead investigator here. You have demonstrated repeatedly that your only skill is cultivating mold in the police station. You are to stay out of the way. Do not speak to the witnesses. Do not touch the evidence. If I see you doing anything other than standing in a corner looking thick, I will personally see to it that you are demoted to a desk job in the most miserable substation in the Highlands. Yes, sir, Hamish said, lowering his eyes to the ground. Inside, he was already calculating the time it would take for Blair to inevitably bungle this. Blair turned his attention back to the scene. He began barking orders with the authority of a man who had never actually solved a murder on his own. He insisted on having the entire area cordoned off with bright yellow police tape, although the only people around were the local sheep, who were unlikely to compromise the scene. He ordered his men to photograph the body from 20 different angles, insisted that the water be drained immediately, thereby destroying any forensic evidence that might have been floating in it, and spent a solid 10 minutes trying to identify the missing shoe as a key piece of occult paraphernalia before being corrected by a younger, more sensible officer. Hamish watched with a heavy heart. He knew that Blair's focus on McLean was not just wrong. It was dangerously distracting. The DCI was so desperate to close the case quickly, to gain the praise of his superiors, that he was already building a narrative that fit his own prejudices. He wanted a local villain, a simple motive, and a quick confession. He didn't want the truth. As Blair continued to shout at the trembling farmer, Hamish began to drift away. He didn't walk fast. He simply shuffled, keeping his head down and his posture slumped. He moved toward the perimeter, his eyes darting across the ground. He looked for the narrow heel print he had spotted earlier. It was gone. Blair's men had tramped all over the soft earth around the trough, their heavy lug-soled boots, obliterating any trace of the person who had been standing there. Hamish felt a surge of genuine, sharp anger. The very people sent to protect it were systematically erasing the evidence. He leaned against a fence post, closing his eyes for a moment to center himself. He could still smell that faint, lingering scent of lavender and musk. It hadn't been a farmer. It had been someone else. Someone who was likely sitting in the village right now, listening to the commotion, confident that Blair's bluster would steer the investigation in exactly the wrong direction. He's going to arrest the wrong man, Lugs, Hamish whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Lugs let out a soft, sympathetic bark. Hamish opened his eyes and looked back at the circus Blair had created. He knew the drill. To save the innocent, he would have to work in the shadows, move beneath the notice of the loud, raging man who considered himself his superior. He would have to start mooching for clues. And he would have to start doing it now, before the trail went completely cold. The murder of Richard Sterling was not just a tragedy. It was a puzzle, and for the first time in a long while, Hamish Macbeth found himself almost interested in solving it. By mid-afternoon, the initial excitement of the murder had settled into a sullen, watchful silence over Lochdabuff. DCI Blair, having successfully terrorized the McLean family to the point of near catatonia, had retreated to the village pub to organize his files and shout at his subordinates. This left the village streets mostly clear, which suited Hamish Macbeth perfectly. Hamish didn't investigate like a policeman. He didn't interview suspects in cold, stark rooms with bright lights. Nor did he demand signed affidavits. He mooched. It was an art form he had perfected over years of living in a village that valued gossip over truth. His first stop was the post office, It was the central nervous system of the village, presided over by Mrs. Cruikshank, a woman who could deduce the state of a marriage by the frequency of postcard mailings. "Terrible business, Hamish," she said, before he had even opened his mouth. She was busy stamping letters with a rhythmic, aggressive thwack, 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 and that Blair man shouting at poor old McLean. "It's a disgrace. If you ask me, he wouldn't know a murderer if one was standing right behind him wearing a name tag." "He's a busy man, Mrs. Cruikshank," Hamish said, leaning against the counter and looking aimlessly at a display of postcards featuring Highland cows. "Big city thinking. Doesn't have the time for our local pace. Did Mr. Sterling have many posts? He was here for a day or two." Mrs. Cruikshank stopped stamping. Her eyes narrowed behind her spectacles. "Only one letter, heavy cream envelope, thick cardstock. Delivered by private courier this morning, after the poor man was already in the sheep dip. I've still got it here." She slid the envelope across the counter. It was addressed to Sterling at the Lochdebuff Inn. The return address was a firm of solicitors in Edinburgh Sinclair, Vance, and Hamish felt a sharp prickle of annoyance. He couldn't use that name, and he didn't need to. He noted the firm's name and tucked the information away. "Did he have any visitors?" Hamish asked, sounding as if he were just making conversation. "Only the lady," Mrs. Cruikshank said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tall thing, very elegant. Stood there yesterday afternoon, right where you're standing. They were arguing. I couldn't hear the words, but the way he was pointing his finger, disgraceful. And she had the look of a woman who was holding onto a very sharp knife, if you take my meaning. Any idea who she was? None at all. But she didn't come off the bus. She had a silver car parked down the lane. Expensive. Left a trail of that fancy lavender perfume behind her. Hamish thanked her, grabbed a couple of free biscuits from a jar on the counter, and wandered back out into the cold. Lavender. The scent he had caught at the crime scene. It wasn't a villager. It was someone who had come here specifically to see Sterling, and likely to ensure he never left. His next stop was the curry shop, where he found the owner, Harry, scrubbing the floor with an intensity that suggested he was trying to erase the very memory of the murder. "Hamish," Harry sighed, leaning on his mop. "This is bad for business. Tourists don't like eating in a village where people are found dead in troughs. Blair has been here twice today, demanding to know if I saw anyone suspicious lurking about." "And did you?" Hamish asked, opening a packet of tea he had borrowed from the station earlier. "Everyone is suspicious in a village like this, Hamish, you know that." Harry chuckled. "But no, I didn't see the killer. I did see Sterling, though. He was sitting in the corner there last night. He was drinking whiskey and talking to someone on his mobile phone. Very quiet, very intense. He kept saying, 'The land is worth more than the history, and I don't care who gets hurt.' He seemed worried about someone, but he was more angry than anything. Did he mention any names? He said something about the estate and the deadline, and he kept looking at his watch like he was waiting for someone to arrive." Hamish nodded, his mind working through the threads. A solicitor's letter, a mysterious woman in a silver car, an argument about land rights, and a deadline. It was starting to look less like a random act of rural violence, and more like a calculated execution over money. He left the shop and headed toward the lock, needing a moment of silence to process. He sat on a cold stone bench, letting lugs chase a seagull that was far too fast for him. The pieces were forming a picture, but it wasn't the picture Blair was painting. Blair wanted a simple, angry local farmer, but reality was much more cynical. Sterling wasn't just a loud, annoying Sassenach. He was an agent of disruption, a man who had been threatening something, or someone, that had deep roots here. He thought about the woman in the silver car. She had been elegant, cold, and composed. She hadn't looked like a woman who would lose her temper in a public post office, unless the stakes were incredibly high. Hamish looked across the water, the dark, mirrored surface of the loch, holding its secrets tightly. He knew he was getting closer, but he also knew that for every step he took toward the truth, he had to take 2 steps back into his lazy persona to avoid Blair's radar. He was a puzzle wrapped in a thick wool sweater, a detective who didn't want to be caught detecting. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. Hamish felt the familiar, low-level hum of the hunt. He had the motive, he had the scent of the woman, and he had the knowledge that the village was holding its breath. He just needed to find the connection before Blair arrested someone innocent, and the real killer slipped away into the twilight. He stood up, shivered in the biting wind, and started the long, slow walk back to the station. There was still a lot of tea to be made, and many more questions to be asked, very, very quietly. The following morning, the atmosphere in Lochdover felt suffocating. DCI Blair had spent the night in the pub, fueled by a mixture of cheap scotch and his own mounting paranoia, and was now back on the prowl. He had decided that if the farmer was too old for the job, it must be the farmer's son. Despite the boy having an ironclad alibi involving a tractor, a broken axle, and 3 witnesses, Hamish, having successfully avoided Blair by hiding in the back room of the bakery, decided it was time to seek counsel from the one person whose insight he truly valued, Priscilla Halberton Smythe. Priscilla was the daughter of the local grandee and, in Hamish's estimation, the most infuriatingly perceptive woman in the Highlands. Their relationship was a complex, tangled mess of unspoken feelings, social class divides, and mutual frustration. She was currently at the village hall, overseeing the preparations for the upcoming autumn fete, looking utterly composed despite the local crisis. "Hamish," she said, not looking up from a clipboard as he wandered in, trying to look as though he had simply lost his way. "I suppose you're here to avoid Blair. I heard him shouting at the butcher from 3 streets away." "He's a man of great enthusiasm," Hamish said, slouching against a stack of folding chairs. "I just need a moment of peace, and perhaps a bit of advice. You knew Richard Sterling, didn't you? He was poking around your father's estate yesterday." Priscilla paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "He was, yes. He was arrogant, entitled, and entirely convinced that everyone in this village was waiting to sell their heritage to the highest bidder. My father was quite livid with him, but I imagine half the village was. Did he mention anyone else? Any associates? A woman, perhaps? Elegant, silver car, smelled of lavender." Priscilla frowned, a flicker of genuine interest crossing her face. "A woman? No, he didn't mention a woman, but he did mention a meeting. He said he was meeting someone who understood the true value of the land. I assumed he was talking about a rival developer." Hamish sighed, feeling a familiar ache in his chest. It seems this wasn't just about timber. There's something more, something that made him desperate. "Hamish," Priscilla said, stepping closer, her voice lowering, "you're acting as if you're actually investigating. Are you?" "I'm just observing," Hamish said, his voice dropping into its practiced, lazy drawl. "I don't like the look of things, Priscilla. Blair is going to ruin a perfectly innocent family, and the person who actually killed Sterling will get away with it. I can't have that on my conscience. It's too much paperwork." Priscilla laughed, a dry, sharp sound. "You and your paperwork, you know. You are a far better detective than you let on. It's a pity you're so determined to hide it. If you actually tried, you might be a chief inspector yourself one day." "God forbid," Hamish shuddered. "I'd rather be a ghost." She leaned in, her eyes searching for him. "Listen to me, Hamish. Sterling wasn't just a developer. He was a collector of sorts. He bought properties that had hidden histories, old titles, abandoned mineral rights, that sort of thing. If he was here, he wasn't just looking at the woods. He was looking for something in the archives. Did you check his room at the inn?" Hamish shook his head. "Blair has it sealed tight. Blair is a fool. He's looking for bloodstains, not paper. If you want to know who killed him, look for what he was trying to find." She gave him a look that was challenging and oddly affectionate. It was moments like these that made Hamish feel both incredibly capable and completely out of his depth. He understood the social dynamics of the village, the grudges, the secrets, the subtle power plays. But Priscilla understood the world beyond the village, the world Sterling inhabited. "I have to go," Hamish said, feeling a sudden sense of urgency. "And thank you, Priscilla. You're—" He struggled for a word that wasn't too revealing. "Helpful. Don't get yourself arrested, Hamish." she called out as he turned to leave, and try to at least look like you're doing your job. He walked out of the hall, the cool air hitting his face. He had a new lead, the archives, the hidden history. He now realized that murder was not about the present, but the past. Sterling had been digging up something someone wanted to stay buried. He did not return to the station. Instead, he started walking toward the local parish library, a dusty, forgotten building on the edge of the village. Had Sterling been looking for something, he would have started there. As he walked, his mind raced. He had the motive, method, and mystery of the woman in the silver car. He felt the weight of the investigation pressing him, but beneath the anxiety, there was a spark of something else, the thrill of the puzzle. He reached the library, the old stone walls cold against the evening air. He knew the librarian, an ancient woman named Miss Murchison, would be there. If he could charm her, he might be able to access the archives before Blair even thought to check them. He adjusted his uniform, smoothed his hair, and put on his most vacant, friendly smile. He was Hamish Macbeth, the local, lazy, harmless policeman. And he was about to find the secret that had cost a man his life. He merely hoped, as he pushed open the creaking library door, that he wasn't too late to stop the next disaster before it even started. The parish library was a tomb of forgotten genealogies and damp-smelling municipal records. Miss Murchison, a woman whose skin had taken on the texture of the vellum she guarded, peered at Hamish over the top of her spectacles. She was, as always, deeply suspicious of anyone who showed an interest in history that didn't involve their own immediate relatives. "The police have already been here, Constable," she said, her voice like grinding stones. "That loud, red-faced man. He made me show him the birth records of every sheep farmer within 10 miles. He seemed convinced that someone was born to be a murderer." "DCI Blair is very thorough," Hamish said, leaning against the checkout desk and trying to look like he was struggling with the complexity of a simple library card application. "I'm just here to double-check a few minor things for the report. You know how it is. The paperwork never ends." Miss Murchison huffed, clearly unimpressed, but she gestured toward the back shelves. "The archives are in the damp room. If you ruin anything, you'll be the one to pay for it." Hamish thanked her and drifted toward the stacks. Once out of sight, his posture straightened. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, his fingers skimming the spines of leather-bound ledgers. He wasn't looking for births or deaths. He was looking for property records. Richard Sterling had been obsessed with land rights. If he had been killed over a document, that document had to be here. He found it wedged behind a pile of 19th century tax assessments. A land survey dated from the late 1922. It wasn't the survey itself that was interesting, but the map attached to it. It highlighted a specific, nondescript patch of moorland, the very patch Sterling had been trying to purchase, and circled a long-abandoned structure marked simply as the oubliette. Hamish frowned. He pulled a notebook from his pocket and scribbled the reference. It wasn't a commercial development site at all. It was an old holding cell, a relic of the days when the local lairds held their own private justice. If Sterling had found proof that the land rights to that structure were still technically held by a family line that had gone extinct, he could have claimed the land for pennies on the pound, effectively stripping the current occupants of their ancestral home. Suddenly, a heavy shadow fell across the aisle. Hamish didn't jump. He just slid the survey back into place with practiced ease and turned, his face reverting to a look of mild, sleepy confusion. It was Sergeant McLean, no relation to the farmer, one of Blair's lackeys. He was holding a file with a look of extreme self-importance. "Macbeth," he barked, "what are you doing back here?" "The chief inspector has officially declared the investigation a closed matter. He's about to make an arrest." Hamish blinked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "An arrest already? But the evidence is all there, you fool. We found the missing shoe." Hamish felt his stomach drop. "Where?" "In the McLean farm tack room, hidden under a pile of horse blankets. Blair says the boy, the farmer's son, must have panicked, killed the man, and hid the shoe, only to realize he couldn't get rid of it. We're heading over to pick him up now. The chief inspector is going to call the press. He's going to be a hero." Hamish felt a cold wave of realization. Shoes hidden in tack room. It was too neat, too perfect. The farmer's son was a simple lad. He wouldn't have known how to hide a shoe, and he certainly wouldn't have been clever enough to leave it in his own barn. It was a plant. The killer had framed the most obvious suspect, and Blair, in his arrogance, had swallowed it whole. "I see," Hamish said, his voice quiet. He had to act. If Blair arrested the boy, the real killer would have the perfect cover. "Well, I suppose I should go and witness the arrest." "Stay here, Macbeth," the sergeant commanded. "Your incompetence is noted. You're off the case." As the sergeant marched out, Hamish felt a surge of cold, hard focus. The red herring was exactly that. A distraction intended for a man who wasn't looking for the truth. He knew now that the killer was watching this, waiting for the arrest to be made so they could slip away. He didn't wait. As soon as the librarian's back was turned, Hamish slipped out the side door, his mind racing. He had the location, the oubliette, and he had the realization that the murderer was someone with access to both the farm and the legal documents, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate Blair's ego. He wasn't going to the McLean farm to watch the arrest. He was going to the moor. He had a feeling that the extinct lineage wasn't as extinct as the records suggested. He just needed to find the evidence before Blair destroyed the last hope of justice in Lockdover. The game was no longer about mooching. It was about survival. He checked his pockets, made sure his torch was working, and set off into the gathering dark. The silence of the Highlands felt heavier than ever, pregnant with the weight of the coming confrontation. He knew the killer would be there, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. And this time, Hamish Macbeth wouldn't be playing the fool. The walk to the moor was a grueling trek through knee-deep heather and freezing, boggy ground that threatened to pull the boots off Hamish's feet with every step. The wind had picked up a mournful, howling thing that whipped his red hair into his eyes. But Hamish didn't slow his pace. He wasn't the slow-moving, lazy constable now. He was a man with a target, his movements fluid and purposeful as he navigated the treacherous terrain by the faint silvery light of the moon. "The oubliette," he muttered, Lug shivering at his heels. "A perfect place to bury a secret?" As he approached the desolate structure, a crumbling stone circle that had once been a prison, the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The land didn't just contain a ruin, it contained a record. If the land rights had indeed reverted to an extinct line, that meant the current owner, the local estate manager who had been so helpful to Blair, had been lying through his teeth. He reached the perimeter of the ruins. The structure was little more than a mound of moss-covered granite, but in the center, hidden beneath a heavy slab of slate, was a dry, narrow opening that led down into the earth. Hamish pried the slab aside with a grunt of exertion, his muscles corded and taut. He clicked on his torch, the beam cutting through the damp darkness to reveal a small, subterranean room. It wasn't a dungeon anymore, it was an office. A desk, a chair, and a filing cabinet stood in the center, perfectly preserved in the cool, dry air. And there, sitting on the desk, was a ledger. Hamish descended the narrow stone steps, his heart hammering against his ribs. He opened the ledger, and the motive for the murder lay bare. It was a list of names, dates, and payments, a secret ledger of the estate's true ownership, showing that the land had not been extinct, but had been illegally seized and sold off in pieces by the estate manager to pay for his own debts. Richard Sterling had found it. He hadn't been buying the land, he had been blackmailing the man who had stolen it. "Jealousy and greed," Hamish whispered, his voice echoing in the small, cramped space. The oldest story in the Highlands. The killer wasn't a local farmer or a disgruntled sheep owner. It was the man who had been at Blair's elbow the entire time, whispering into the DCI's ear, feeding him the evidence he needed to frame the McLean boy. He was the one who had worn the perfume, a rare, expensive scent he'd likely stolen from the estate's master collection. And he was the one who had planted the shoe in the barn. He heard a sound above him, a crunch of gravel. A shadow fell across the opening, blocking out the moonlight. "You always were too smart for your own good, Macbeth," a voice called down. It was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of the warmth the man usually projected. Hamish didn't look up. He stood calmly, closing the ledger with a soft final thud. He felt the cold iron of a pistol barrel pointed down the hole. "You killed him because he wouldn't stop, didn't you?" Hamish asked, his voice steady. "He wasn't going to buy the land. He was going to turn you in." "He was a parasite," the man said, his voice tightening. "He thought he could bleed me dry. I had a life here, a reputation. He was going to destroy it for a few pounds of timber. And the McLean boy?" Hamish continued, his hand drifting toward his belt, where he kept his heavy regulation issue torch. "He was just convenient, a way to keep Blair off your scent." "Blair is a loud, blustering idiot," the man spat. It was almost too easy. He wanted a villain so badly he didn't care who it was. Hamish stood in the darkness, the beam of his torch pointing away from the stairs toward the back of the room. He needed to get out, but he had to be careful. The man above him was desperate, and a desperate man was more dangerous than a professional one. "You won't get away with it," Hamish said, moving slowly, deliberately toward the shadows of the far wall. "The evidence is here, in this book. And I know about the silver car. I know about the lavender perfume. You weren't as careful as you thought. It doesn't matter," the man replied, his voice chillingly calm. "Because you're not going to leave this hole, Macbeth. Nobody knows you're here. The village thinks you're on a mental health leave after your failure at the farm. They'll find your body in a few months, and they'll call it a tragic accident. A drunken fall, a lost soul in the hills." Hamish felt the cold sweat prickling his skin. He was trapped, and the man above him had all the advantages. But he also had something the killer didn't: local knowledge. A dog who was currently growling softly in the corner, and a lifetime of learning how to survive the Highlands. He looked at the narrow, stone-walled room. He saw a pile of loose, crumbling granite in the corner, the result of years of erosion. If he could trigger a collapse, he could create a distraction. A mess, way to move. "You think you're the smartest one inches the room, don't you?" Hamish asked, his voice low, a challenge. "I know I am," the man said. Hamish didn't wait. He grabbed a heavy piece of stone, braced himself, and threw it with all his strength, not at the man, but at the support beam holding up the ceiling of the oubliette. The wood groaned, splintered, and gave way. A cascade of dirt and stone began to pour down into the room, creating a wall of debris between Hamish and the opening. He didn't need to win the fight. He just needed to survive the night. He grabbed the ledger, tucked it into his jacket, and pulled lugs close. It was time to change plans. The trap was about to be sprung, and he was the one holding the string. The collapse of the oubliette's ceiling provided Hamish with exactly the chaotic exit he needed. As the stones tumbled and a suffocating plume of ancient dust filled the subterranean chamber, he didn't wait to see if the killer had been injured by the shifting debris. He threw himself into the narrow, dark tunnel that had once served as a drainage pipe for the prison. It was narrow, slick with slime, and smelled of centuries of decay. But it was an escape route. Lugs scrambled ahead of him, his claws clicking on the wet stone. Hamish emerged, shivering into the freezing night air, some 50 yards from the ruins, on the opposite side of a dense thicket of gorse. Behind him, he heard the frantic cursing of the estate manager, the man who, until moments ago, had seemed the epitome of local respectability. He was thrashing about in the ruin, firing his pistol into the darkness in blind, impotent rage. Hamish didn't run. He moved with a hunter's deliberate silence, circling back toward the perimeter of the moor. He had the ledger tucked firmly inside his tunic, held against his chest like a holy relic. This little book of secrets was the key, but it was also a death warrant. He needed to get it to a place where it couldn't be destroyed, and he needed to ensure that when the endgame came, he held all the cards. He bypassed the main track, knowing the killer would head there, expecting Hamish to flee toward the village. Instead, Hamish cut through the dense, boggy heart of the woods, heading for the old crofter's cottage he used as a secret retreat. It was a place Blair never visited because it lacked electricity and, more importantly, a phone line. Once inside the drafty, stone-walled room, Hamish lit a single lantern, shielding it carefully, so no light escaped the heavy shutters. He sat at the rough-hewn table, the ledger open before him. The names, the offshore accounts, the forged deeds. It was all there in meticulous, damning detail. The killer had been incredibly organized, which was, ironically, his greatest weakness. Hamish began to construct his trap. He didn't need to be faster or stronger than the man. He just needed to be more deceptive. He pulled out a piece of thick parchment and a fountain pen. He began to write a note, mimicking the stiff, formal handwriting of a legal assistant. He addressed it to the local newspaper editor, detailing the discovery of the Sterling papers, and indicating that a copy had been sent to the Strathbane Police Headquarters as an insurance policy. It was a complete lie. He hadn't sent anything yet, and he couldn't, given that the nearest post office was miles away, and the roads were being patrolled by Blair's men. But the killer didn't know that. Hamish then set the stage. He left the fake copy of the ledger, a bundle of old, meaningless receipts tied with string, prominently on the table, surrounded by a mess of scattered papers to make it look like a hurried departure. He then grabbed his heavy wool coat, his lantern, and a length of sturdy, coarse rope. He didn't go back to the ruins. He went to the old, rusted iron bridge that spanned the ravine leading out of the valley, the only route back to town for anyone on foot. It was a place of high drama, narrow and precarious, perfect for a confrontation. He spent 20 minutes rigging a series of tripwires using thin, transparent fishing line attached to a collection of empty tin cans filled with stones. If anyone tried to cross the bridge in the dark, they would announce their arrival with a clatter loud enough to wake the dead. He then retreated to the shadows beneath the bridge's stone abutments, his back against the cold granite. He waited, his breathing slow and rhythmic, his senses tuned to the shifting wind and the distant, mournful hoot of an owl. He didn't have to wait long. An hour before dawn, a set of headlights cut through the darkness, moving slowly up the track toward the woods. The estate manager, the man was desperate now, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, jagged edge. He stopped his silver car, the same one Mrs. Cruikshank had noticed. At the edge of the bridge, Hamish watched as the man stepped out, his silhouette backlit by the car's headlights. He was holding a flashlight in one hand and a weapon in the other. He began to cross the bridge, walking cautiously, his eyes scanning the gloom. Click! The sound was sharp and metallic. The killer froze, the fishing line snagging his ankle. He looked down, panicked, and then clatter, clatter. The tin cans danced on the bridge deck, echoing through the ravine like a volley of gunfire. "Come out, Macbeth," the man shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I know you're here. You think you're clever, but you're just a country fool playing a dangerous game." Hamish didn't move. He kept his eyes on the man's shadow, waiting. The trap was set. The rumor of the leaked documents was planted in the killer's mind, and the bridge was now a stage. The man was walking into a vacuum of his own making, terrified by the very silence he had helped create. Hamish felt a strange, cold calm. The village was still, the wind had died down, and the final move was his to make. He adjusted his grip on the rope and prepared to step out of the shadows. The lazy constable was gone. There was only the man who would ensure that justice came to Lockdoff, whether DCI Blair liked it or not. The bridge shuddered as the estate manager stepped forward, his flashlight beam slicing wildly through the mist. He was breathing hard, the ragged, wet sound of a man whose nerves had been stripped raw by his own greed and the mounting pressure of the hunt. He crossed the center of the span, his boots ringing hollowly on the rusted iron plates. He was exposed, nervous, and utterly convinced that Hamish was lurking in the shadows just ahead, clutching the damning evidence of his crimes. "I know you have it," the man bellowed, his voice climbing an octave, hitting the high, brittle note of hysteria. "Give me the ledger, you idiot. You have no idea what you're meddling in. These are matters of property law. History, you're just a village constable who can't even hold onto his own tea mug. You think you're a hero? You're a footnote, Macbeth. A sad, pathetic little footnote that's about to be erased." Hamish didn't answer. He remained perfectly still, pressed against the damp, moss-covered granite of the bridge's foundation. He could see the man's feet, clad in expensive, mud-caked Chelsea boots, hesitating just inches from the primary tripwire. The man stopped, pointing his weapon toward the darkness, where he assumed Hamish was hiding. He was shaking, the barrel of the pistol tracing jagged arcs through the air. "Come out," the killer screamed again. "I'll kill you. I'll make sure they never even find enough of you to bury. I have connections, money, influence. Do you hear me?" "You are nothing." Hamish took a slow, steadying breath. He knew the man's arrogance was his anchor, but his fear was his engine. He waited until the man took one more aggressive step, a movement that placed his leading foot directly over the loop of coarse rope Hamish had hidden in the darkness. Hamish pulled. The rope whipped taut, snagging the man's ankle and sending him sprawling forward with a sudden, undignified violence. The man hit the bridge deck hard, his pistol skittering away and disappearing over the edge into the black, rushing waters of the ravine below. His flashlight flew from his hand, spinning across the iron plates before rolling to a stop, casting a stark, blinding beam directly into the man's terrified face. Hamish stepped out from the shadows. He didn't look lazy now. He didn't look like a man who spent his days avoiding work. His eyes were hard, focused, and utterly devoid of mercy. He was, as he had always been, the most dangerous man in the room, and he was finally done playing the fool. "You're right about one thing," Hamish said, his voice cold and cutting through the mountain air. "I am a village policeman, and in this village, we don't take kindly to people who hurt our own." The killer scrambled backward, clawing at the rusted iron, his face a mask of primal panic. He tried to stand, but Hamish was already there, his movements quick and decisive. He lunged, pinning the man against the bridge railing. The iron groaned under the weight of them both, vibrating with the force of the struggle. The killer fought with the frantic, clawing strength of a cornered animal, swinging wildly. But Hamish was stronger, fueled by years of hard, quiet labor in the hills. He didn't hit the man. He simply pinned him, using his weight and the leverage of his position to lock the man's arms behind his back. "You're finished," Hamish gritted out, his face inches from the man's. "The ledger is safe. It's with people who know exactly how to read it. Your estate, your influence, your history, it's all gone. And by morning, DCI Blair will have a very clear picture of who actually killed Richard Sterling." "You can't," the man gasped, his body going limp under Hamish's iron grip. "Blair won't listen. He's already decided. He's going to arrest the McLean boy. Blair will listen when I hand him the ledger," Hamish said, pulling a set of cold steel handcuffs from his belt. "He's a vain man, yes. He likes his medals and his praise, but he's not a murderer. When the evidence is overwhelming, he'll take the win, even if it means admitting he was looking at the wrong suspect all along. I'll let him take the credit. I'll let him bask in the glory. Just so long as you are locked away where you can never hurt anyone in Lockdown again." The man went silent, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a hollow, defeated realization. He sagged against the railing, his eyes fixed on the darkness below the bridge. Hamish clicked the cuffs shut, the sharp, final sound echoing against the silence of the glen. He stood up, pulling the killer to his feet. The man was trembling now, a broken figure. Hamish grabbed his shoulder, turning him back toward the road where the silver car sat, its headlights still cutting a lonely path into the fog. "It's a long walk to the station," Hamish said, his voice returning to a neutral, conversational tone, "but I think you've got plenty of time to consider your life choices." He marched the man toward the vehicle, his grip firm and unyielding. The battle was over. The undercurrent of darkness that had threatened to consume the village had been drawn into the light. For the first time in days, the air felt clean. Hamish didn't feel like a hero. He felt exhausted, his muscles aching from the cold and the fight. He felt a deep, profound hunger for a hot cup of tea and a quiet chair. He reached the car, shoved the man into the passenger seat, and climbed into the driver's side. As he started the engine, he looked back at the bridge one last time. The piece of lockduff had been broken, but it was mending, and tomorrow he would have to deal with the aftermath. The questions, the shock, and the inevitable, roaring fury of DCI Blair. But as he put the car in gear and turned away from the ravine, Hamish felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The village was safe. His secret was his own. And by this time tomorrow, he hoped to be back to his perfectly, wonderfully lazy routine. The drive back to the village was punctuated only by the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the tires against the frost-heaved road and the labored, shallow breathing of the man in the passenger seat. Hamish kept his hands loose on the wheel, his eyes scanning the horizon for the first signs of dawn. He had the ledger tucked into the side pocket of the car, a silent, heavy witness to the night's events. He knew the moment he arrived at the station, the dynamics would shift. He had to be delicate. He had to be the fool again, or else the promotion he dreaded would become an immediate, terrifying reality. As they pulled into the outskirts of Lochdover, the village was waking up in shades of bruised purple and grey. The station was already a hub of activity. Blair's 2 patrol cars were parked haphazardly on the grass, and the DCI himself was standing on the steps, shouting into a radio with the kind of performative intensity that suggested he was doing it for an audience that wasn't there. Hamish pulled the silver car to a stop behind one of the police cruisers. He stepped out, his face carefully composed into an expression of profound, wide-eyed bewilderment. He opened the passenger door and gestured for the estate manager to emerge. Blair stopped mid-shout. He stared, his face turning that familiar, dangerous shade of purple as he took in the sight of the handcuffed man and the dishevelled, mud-streaked constable. "Macbeth," Blair roared, marching down the steps. "What is the meaning of this? You were ordered to remain off the case. And why are you driving the suspect's vehicle? Have you gone completely insane?" Hamish scratched his head, looking down at his boots as if he were trying to remember the alphabet. "Well, sir, it was a bit of a coincidence, really. I was out, walking the dog lugs, needed a run, and I stumbled across this gentleman near the bridge. He seemed to be having a bit of trouble with his car, and I thought, well, he looked a bit suspicious, like someone who might have been involved in the business with the trough." Blair stopped inches from Hamish, his nostrils flared. "A coincidence. You were walking the dog. You are an absolute, terminal imbecile, Macbeth. You have absolutely no idea what you are doing. We have the McLean boy in custody. We have the shoe. This is a closed matter, and you have compromised it." "Yes, sir," Hamish said, his voice shrinking into a timid, apologetic mumble. "But, see, I found this book in his car. I thought it looked like it might be important, though I can't read the legal bits myself, of course. It's all very complicated." He reached into the car and pulled out the ledger. He held it out to Blair as if it were a heavy, dangerous object, his fingers trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sure it's nothing, just some silly lists and numbers. But I thought you should have it, since you're the one in his charge." Blair snatched the ledger, his lip curling in contempt. He flipped it open, intending to dismiss it as more of Hamish's rural nonsense. But as his eyes scanned the first page, the dates, the names, the clear, undeniable records of the illicit land sales, and the payments linked to the estate manager, his expression transformed. The arrogance flickered, replaced by a sudden, sharp, predatory gleam. He realized exactly what he was holding. He realized that this wasn't just a list. It was the front page of every newspaper in Scotland. Blair looked up at Hamish, then at the estate manager, and finally back at the ledger. He didn't thank Hamish. He didn't acknowledge the nights of work, the cold, the danger, or the cleverness required to secure the evidence. Instead, he straightened his uniform, puffed out his chest, and looked at his subordinates. "Sergeant," Blair bellowed, his voice booming across the quiet village street. "Change of plans. We have been misled by a local fabrication of evidence, clearly a plant by the real perpetrator. Secure this man immediately. I have just uncovered the true motive and the missing link in the Sterling case. It appears we have been dealing with a far more complex web of corruption than we initially anticipated." He turned to Hamish, his eyes narrowing. "You, Macbeth, you will go inside and write a report. Keep it brief. Leave out your personal theories and ensure that you acknowledge my direct oversight in this breakthrough. If I see a single word about your dog walking, I will have you scrubbing the floors of the station for the next 6 months. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Hamish said, his voice perfectly hollow. "I'll write it exactly as you say, sir. Get out of my sight." Hamish tipped his cap, turned, and walked toward the station, his back hunched, his shoulders sagging with every step. He didn't look back as Blair began to bark orders, already crafting the narrative of his own genius. He could hear the DCI spinning the story, taking the credit, and ensuring that no one would ever suspect the lazy constable had been the one to solve the murder. Inside the station, Hamish sank into his chair. He was exhausted. His joints ached, and his uniform was caked in mud. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot he'd left on the stove. It was stone cold and bitter. But he drank it anyway. He had done it. He had caught the killer, saved the innocent boy, and kept his life exactly as he wanted it. No promotion, no transfer, no city life, just the cold coffee, the quiet village, and the knowledge that justice had been served, even if the wrong man got the headline. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and allowed himself the luxury of a long, deep, and utterly deserved sleep. The days following the arrest of the estate manager were a blur of frenetic, high-decibel activity that seemed to oscillate around the village like a localized storm. DCI Blair, having successfully positioned himself as the brilliant, tireless investigator who had cracked the case wide open, spent his time posing for photos with the local press and giving grand, sweeping interviews about his methodical approach to uncovering complex criminal networks. He had, as expected, taken full credit for the recovery of the ledger, painting it as the result of a strenuous, deep-cover operation that he had personally spearheaded. Hamish Macbeth, meanwhile, had receded into the background, becoming once again the invisible, sleepy-eyed constable, who seemed to have spent the entire week napping in his office, while the real police did the work. By the weekend, the storm had passed. The news vans departed, the flashing lights disappeared, and the quiet, heavy blanket of the Highlands returned to Lockduff. The village seemed to inhale, a deep, collective breath that signaled the end of the disruption. The McLean family, cleared of all suspicion, returned to their farm. The villagers went back to their grumbling about the weather, the price of tea, and the general state of the world, having successfully reclaimed their isolation. Hamish sat at the weathered kitchen table in his small house on the edge of the village. It was a clear, crisp evening, the kind where the stars seemed to hang low and bright over the jagged silhouettes of the mountains. He had a fire crackling in the hearth, the heat chasing away the lingering damp of the moors, and on the stove, a large iron pot bubbled with a rich, fragrant stew. It was a simple meal, but it was his, and tonight it tasted like absolute luxury. Lugs were stretched out on the rug, snoring with a contented, rhythmic sound that Hamish found immensely comforting. The dog had endured the stress of the chase with surprising grace, and now he seemed perfectly happy to return to the life of a housebound. Lazy pet. Hamish reached down to scratch the dog's ears, his mind wandering over the events of the past few days. He thought about Sterling, the man whose arrogance had led to such a messy end, and the estate manager whose greed had blinded him to the reality of the small, tight-knit community he had tried to exploit. It was a grim business, murder, but it was over. The village was safe, and for Hamish, that was the only metric of success that mattered. There was a soft, tentative knock at the door. Hamish frowned, wondering who would be out at this hour, but he stood up, smoothing his disheveled hair. He opened the door to find Priscilla Halberton, Smythe, standing on the step, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. "I heard the village was finally quiet again," she said, her voice soft, with a hint of that familiar sharp amusement. "I thought you might appreciate the company of someone who doesn't want to talk about Blair's latest press conference." Hamish stood aside, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. "You're always welcome, Priscilla. The stew is just about ready. It's not much, but it's warm." "It smells divine," she said, stepping inside. She looked around the modest room, her eyes lingering on the stack of old, worn books on the table and the simple, functional furniture. There was a moment of silence between them, not the awkward, heavy kind, but the comfortable, resonant silence that had developed between them over years of shared secrets and unspoken understandings. They sat together as the evening deepened, talking about everything and nothing: the upcoming winter preparations, the state of the local gardens, the absurdity of the recent news cycle. Hamish didn't mention the ledger, and Priscilla didn't ask. They both knew the truth of what had happened, and that was enough. As he watched her, Hamish felt a strange, quiet contentment. He had sacrificed his reputation for laziness to keep his life the way he wanted it. And yet, in the quiet spaces between their conversation, he realized that he wouldn't trade his small, hidden world for any amount of professional acclaim. He liked being the man who knew things, the man who guarded the peace from the shadows. And he liked that Priscilla was the only one who truly saw the man behind the mask. When she finally left, disappearing into the dark, cold night, Hamish locked the door and returned to his chair by the fire. He poured a final, small glass of whiskey, savoring the warmth as it spread through his chest. He looked around his home, the humble, sturdy place that was his sanctuary outside. The wind howled around the chimney, a lonely, wild sound that usually brought a sense of isolation. But tonight, it just sounded like home. He stayed in Lockduff. He had avoided the move to the city, the demands of a higher rank, and the crushing weight of bureaucratic expectation. He had solved the mystery, protected the innocent, and managed to stay exactly where he belonged. As he listened to the fire crackle and felt the steady, peaceful rhythm of the house, Hamish let out a long, slow sigh of relief. The case was closed, the village was safe, and tomorrow was just another day of doing absolutely nothing of note, which was, quite possibly, the greatest victory of all. He was Hamish Macbeth, the laziest, smartest, and most content policeman in the entire Highlands. And for once, there was nowhere else on earth he would rather be. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the fire pulling him into a deep, peaceful sleep, ready for the quiet, lazy days ahead.